So we had a major bombshell this week in the NFL. The former Dolphins coach, who was just recently fired, has filed a lawsuit against the NFL that alleges that there is discrimination in hiring practices. And yeah, I mean, on the face of it, yeah, the cause that he's seeking seems to be pretty
Well,
noble.
like I was going to say, like, the main thing is, does he have a point? Like, yeah, I think he has a point.
Yep.
But I do think it's complicated. I think sometimes some of the coverage has been a little slanted one way, like, oh, this is absolutely horrible. And I'm like, no, he has a point, but it depends, when you start analyzing individual decisions that get made about who got hired, it's kind of like, yeah, I can see a problem here, but then there's this, and that, there's a variety of things going on. So it's hard to really say, that it's just, well, there's 32 or 31, racist owners or racist GMs or something, because there's African American general managers too. So.
Yeah, I definitely think the NFL's hiring practices are a problem. There's definitely an issue there, but a lot of the main stuff that was brought out in this lawsuit seems to be like for publicity or to generate attention, because one of the claims is that the Dolphins owner tried to pay him $100,000 per game to lose in 2019.
Yeah.
And I mean, my first thought on that is, I mean, listen, the Dolphins tried to cheat and they still can't do it right. They still can't figure this out.
They can't even cheat. Yeah.
They can't even do that. The Patriots have been cheating forever and mostly get away with it. But the Dolphins can't figure this out. It just blows my mind. But that's sensational, but I'm not sure what that has to do with the main point of the case. John Elway showing up to a job interview, I guess hungover or tired or whatever.
Yeah. So what I thought that was interesting. Like, the claim that Brian Flores made, I'm like, okay, I can see how that could possibly happen, And he said that they were like 45 minutes late to the interview, and then Elway said that they were flying all night because they had an interview in Denver. And then they had to fly overnight on a private jet to New England or to Rhode Island, I think, because this was, the Patriots were getting ready to play the Super Bowl. This was 3 years ago.
Right.
So his claim was that they were only on a few hours of sleep, but they were giving him they were taking the interview seriously. It was in good faith. They had every interest in getting to know him a little bit better to see if he would be the guy that they would hire as their head coach. So it's plausible. His explanation of that is plausible. I don't really, and the problem is, how do you determine when an interview isn't really in good faith? And even the thing with the Giants,
that's how you decide an interview is not in good faith. When somebody texts you 3 days before you interview and says, "I heard this guy got the job."
Right. Yeah. Well, but see, here's the thing. Even with that, I mean, it would be naive to think that, like, when an owner or general manager fires a coach, that they don't already have maybe a guy that they want in mind, but they're still going to interview people to kind of see if, is this really the guy we want, or is, whatever else. I mean, like, for instance, if they had Brian Daboll in mind and then they interviewed him and the interview didn't go well, they might have hired somebody else. So to me, it's just more complicated. Now, I can understand Brian Flores being kind of humiliated. Well, he said he was humiliated because he gets that text and it's like, oh, why am I going to go interview for this job when it's already been given to somebody else? Which I totally get that. And then this week, like, reading and listening to a lot of stuff, other Black head coaches have said that this is kind of a frustration they've had with the Rooney Rule, where they feel like some of these interviews are just sham. Like Marvin Lewis was talking about this, where he when he was trying to when Carolina was searching for a head coach after they got rid of Ron Rivera, and Marvin Lewis had been fired, so he was I guess he had heard some media reports that the Panthers were leaning toward hiring somebody And then he's like, well, he's talking to like his agent or somebody else, like, well, why am I going to go interview? And it's like, well, you get your name out there, you interview, you meet more people, whatever. So it's kind of a thing where like you feel like the interview's a sham, but you go through it anyway just to, make some connections or whatever. Yeah. Again, it's complicated. I understand the frustration with that because why do you want to go through a sham interview? That sucks. I totally get it. And there's been some decisions that are made that just don't make any sense. Like the one that I keep going back to is Adam Gase was the coach of the Dolphins for 3 years, and he was terrible. He came in, the Dolphins were bad. They made the playoffs 1 year, but they beat a bunch of bad teams, and then they got destroyed in the playoffs by the Steelers, right? So then anyway, he gets fired. 5 minutes later, he gets hired by the Jets. Why the hell are you rehiring that guy? Why does he get a second chance? He was terrible, So you see things like that, and then you see one that I keep coming back to was Jim Caldwell was the coach of the Lions, and they had like 2 winning seasons in a row on the Lions. Okay, and then they fired him and they hired Matt Patricia, who had never been a head coach before. Jim Caldwell had been a coach in Indianapolis before, so you fire him and then you hire Matt Patricia, and Matt Patricia was terrible. They ended up firing him. So it's just things like that. I'm like, that would be frustrating to me if I was a head coaching candidate. Just especially if you're one that has experience and all that. But again, it's complicated because I know I'm ranting right now. I'll just say this point, and then you can go ahead. But like Byron Leftwich was up for being considered for the Jaguars job. Great, he used to be the quarterback there. He's been an offensive coordinator for a few years now. And I guess he was apparently a top candidate, but then he didn't want to work with the general manager in Jacksonville because there's been reports that guy's been a huge douchebag, which that's fine. That's your prerogative if you don't want to work with that guy. But he took his name out of consideration, which, hey, you can just decide who you want to work with. You can decide what jobs you want to take. That's fine. But I feel like then that's going to get spun into, if no black head coaches get hired during this hiring cycle, people are going to be like, well, what the hell? And it's going to be like, well, I mean, there might have been 2, but he took his name out, that's fine. You can go ahead and do that. But yeah, I don't know.
I think, well, first of all, there's a good argument to be made. Some of these teams are too stupid to be racist, which is
yes,
it's a fair argument because some of these teams are just too dumb to be able to figure out how to even, But yeah, I think Flores should have been hired. I think that
he still might. I mean, I'm saying might be. That's got to be like a caveat to that because I don't know. His career is probably over based on the fact that he filed that lawsuit. But we'll see. I mean, the Saints still haven't hired anybody, and the Texans still haven't hired anybody. So
the Dolphins still haven't either. Obviously, he's not getting the Dolphins job. Yeah, I think Flores should have been hired. I think it's kind of ridiculous that he wasn't. But so as we've talked about before, these NFL teams they're bad for a reason. Most of these teams they don't know how to hire a coach anyway, no matter what color they are. I do think there's some merit to what Flores is talking about with these sham interviews. But it just kind of. I'm pulling for Flores. I like him. I think he's a good guy. I hope that this gets somewhere. I hope his coaching career isn't over. But this feels to me like it was kind of thrown together. Because it was only 10 days from when the Giants interview to when he filed the lawsuit. So it just doesn't. This doesn't feel like they've really spent the time.
Well, and it's the whole deal is that for this to be successful, they're counting on other coaches. It's a class action. They're counting on other ones joining the lawsuit, and I don't know. Like one of the things that you'll see with, like for instance, with wage and out, like unpaid overtime class action lawsuits. Some law firms will literally just, they'll write up the lawsuit quickly. They'll interview some former employees or whatever who allege they didn't get overtime. You write up the lawsuit and then you file it, and then you just see who's going to join. Because if you filed a bunch of these, it doesn't take you that long to get up the paperwork and file it. So you file it and you see who joins. If enough people don't join after a while, you just, you move on, you do another one, But I don't know, I don't know how many people are going to join this because you know that if you join this, you're probably ending your coaching career because people are just it's fucked up. But it's like that's what happens. Like if you file a lawsuit against an employer, then your reputation gets destroyed because they're basically like, oh, well, this person's a troublemaker. Nobody wants to hire you, right? Or and that's fucked up and wrong because you want whistleblowers to step up and say stuff so employers get held accountable. But that's just kind of the way it goes.
Yeah, there's actually a better shot of the Dolphins owner getting in trouble for trying to pay for losses in games than there is of Flores really getting substantial things out of the the racist hiring practices part of this.
And I don't know how you prove that offer was made because it's just hearsay at this point.
Well,
it's Flores saying this happened, Ross saying no, it didn't, unless someone else heard it or it was written down somewhere.
Well, interesting story about that. So Cameron Wolf, who works for the NFL Network, put out a story a few days ago that said that there is a witness that can corroborate what Flores is saying. That story was up for about a day and then it disappeared.
Okay.
So we'll see. We'll see what happens. Now, it is a federal crime to try to fix a sporting event. Now, that is going to be really hard to prove because you have to prove that, and you really got to prove that in court. But Stephen Ross can still get into a lot of trouble with the NFL anyway. But if there is a witness, now we're having a different discussion. But the reporter who works for the NFL Network, his story was taken down. Wonder how that works. So anyway, but this is a perfect lead into my point here. I was reading a little bit about what's going on with the Washington football team and their mess. And apparently the NFL and Daniel Snyder agreed to not release any findings unless they both agreed to release it. So they did an investigation. They gave a report on it. Listen to this. So they gave a report on it, not on paper. They gave an oral report on this to the NFL so that there was no documentation of it. Okay? So that way, and there's something called I forget what it's called, but it's called a conflict interest or a something agreement that the Washington team and the NFL came to that said they would not release anything unless both sides agree to release it. So they did this entire investigation and they can just hide all the stuff that happened.
Yeah.
So if those of you not familiar with the Washington football team, they didn't have an HR department. So there was allegations of sexual harassment of their cheerleaders and using their cheerleaders as prostitutes and, all kinds of misogynistic and disgusting things that are way beyond.
He didn't lose his team.
Right. And that's it. Right. And that's another good point. So all of that went on. So it underlines my point, and I've said this before. The NFL does not care about anybody. They don't care about any of this stuff. They don't care who does wrong. You have
to remember the NFL, they're not really, there's an office on Madison Avenue, but the owners own the NFL. It's not, the NFL doesn't have subpoena power with the owners in terms of when they're investigating and stuff. So
Yeah. So listen, like everybody who getting all up in arms, like the NFL is going to do something about this. The NFL will not do anything unless Congress gets involved. And the only reason this Washington football team investigation has become a big deal is because Congress is involved now. Now, the Republicans don't want to do any of this. They don't want this to go on. The Democrats do. So unless Congress jumps in and says, the NFL, you need to fix this and this and this, I hate to say it, but I don't think they're going to change anything.
Well, because the thing you have to remember, though, is like, with hiring, things can be cyclical. There were like 7 or 8 minority coaches just a few years ago, right? And now there's only one. Well, some people got fired, like things could. Doug Gottlieb made this point he was talking about, because he's obviously a college basketball fan, and he was talking about in the Pac-12, they've, in the last several years, they've had several minority coaches, but, some different ones got fired and stuff, so now they don't have any. But that doesn't mean there won't be some in the future.
There will be, but the NBA has 14.
Yeah, no, I get it.
It's not like this is like a, yes, I understand the cyclical argument, but this is it's a bit ridiculous in the NFL.
No,
I
no, I
mean,
get it. Yeah. There's guys who have experience who don't get considered or whatever else. And it's like when the Cardinals they had Steve Wilkes, who was African American, and they fired him after 1 year, and then they hired a college coach with, I don't know if he had any NFL coaching experience, who had a losing record in college at Texas Tech. So that's kind of ridiculous. But then the thing you got to remember is, like, for instance, we were at the beginning of the hiring cycle, we were like, why aren't people considering Doug Peterson more? He won the Super Bowl with Nick Foles. Let me repeat that. He won the Super Bowl with Nick Foles. Okay. So, but he did end up getting hired by the Jaguars. So, like, yeah, there's coaches who are like, why aren't you hiring this guy? Why are you hiring this dude who's never been a coach before?
And by the way, the Jaguars interviewed everybody. They interviewed like 15 people. Like they interviewed every coach that was out there. Like, we can bash some of these teams like the Giants for being ridiculous, but the Jaguars should be given some credit. They interviewed every candidate that there was.
Okay.
So that was pretty incredible. Yeah, I don't understand how Doug Peterson I don't understand what took so long. I really don't.
Yeah.
No idea. Like, they won't, and that being said, and they won't hire Eric Bieniemy from the Kansas City Chiefs. Because he's their offensive coordinator, but the argument is, well, he doesn't call the plays. Well, Doug Peterson used to be in that role, and Matt Nagy used to be in that same role, and they both had head coaching jobs.
Hackett was in that role too.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, again, that one I don't. The only thing I'll say about that is he was a former running back, and I don't know of a lot of examples of former running backs who were NFL head coaches. But yeah, I mean, he's been interviewed a bunch of times. Again, though, I don't know. Like, I don't know how those interviews go. I know that there's kind of a thing that I think minority coach, I've heard that they get frustrated with, is that there's the well, the interview didn't go well, or it wasn't what we were looking for, or whatever. I mean, Tony Dungy was talking about that, and he actually made. I wanted to make sure I got this. Tony Dungy was on the Dan Patrick Show. He made a really good point. He said that I don't think it does anybody any good to be doing these interviews while the playoffs are still going on, because I remember Peter King made the point that a lot of times the coaches who get hired are the offensive and defensive coordinators of the teams that get far into the playoffs. For whatever reason, that's just the way it is. That's how they hire people. But Tony Dungy was saying that kind of does everybody a disservice, because in order for you, if you're on a staff of a team that's competing in the playoffs, you're trying to prepare for a team, but then you're trying to prepare like, oh, I might get this coaching job. And it's like, Dungy made the point that, like, well, if we end this after the season, if you give me a week, I'll have much more to say about your roster and what we can do with the different players you have there, and what other players should we bring in if I have more time to do that. So I do think that's I kind of agree with that. I think that's a really good point.
Yeah. Same thing with college. They should probably delay some of this hiring stuff and make them do it, after the season. It probably would be better for everybody.
Because it's just hard to, like, switch gears when you're, like, so locked in trying to prepare for one, whether it's the conference championship or the Super Bowl or whatever. Like, the other thing was with the Flores interviewing with the Broncos, they had like 3 hours, right? But some of these other candidates, like, weren't in the playoffs. They might spend the whole day with the team. And it's like, well, that's kind of not, you only get 3 hours but this guy gets, half a day with the team. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
So the overall thing is I definitely think there's a point. It's complicated, but unfortunately, I don't know how much is going to happen because of this lawsuit. I really don't.
Yep.
Be too cynical about it, but